Night pressed against the Vatican like a living thing, thick and watchful, clinging to the ancient stone as if it, too, feared what slept inside. The bells of Compline had faded, their echoes dissolving into the narrow Roman streets beyond the walls, leaving behind a silence so deep it rang in the ears. Brother Matteo walked alone through a corridor few were permitted to enter, his sandals whispering against marble polished by centuries of passing feet. Each step felt heavier than the last, as though the building itself resisted him, testing his resolve. He had lived within these walls since boyhood. He knew their rhythms, their prayers, the way dawnlight spilled through high windows and turned dust into gold. He knew which passages smelled of wax and incense and which carried the damp chill of forgotten places. Yet tonight the corridors felt different, stripped of sanctity, reduced to stone and shadow. Under his robe, bound tight against his chest, lay the parchments that had stolen his sleep for weeks. He could feel their edges with every breath, sharp as guilt. It had begun innocently enough, with a request from an elderly archivist whose hands shook too much to copy fragile texts. Matteo had been trusted because he asked few questions and spoke little, because his devotion seemed unshakable. But ink has a way of speaking even when mouths remain closed. As he transcribed faded letters and cracked seals, patterns emerged that prayer could not explain away. Names repeated themselves in accusations. Dates aligned with sudden deaths, unexplained exiles, vanished fortunes. Piety draped the words like silk over steel, blessing actions that reeked of ambition and cruelty. One parchment still burned in his mind, a private letter from a pope to a cardinal ally, thanking him for the swift resolution of an inconvenience. The inconvenience had been a rival cleric found drowned days later, his pockets weighted with stones. Another document recorded payments made not to monasteries or the poor, but to mercenary captains, their services rendered in the dead of night. Marginal notes, scribbled in haste, revealed orders to suppress dissent not through debate or doctrine, but through fear. Matteo had copied each word faithfully, his hand steady even as his faith trembled. He stopped beneath an archway where a single lamp cast trembling light. The air smelled faintly of mold and old leather. Somewhere above him, the living church slept, cardinals in their chambers, guards at their posts, the Pope himself perhaps dreaming beneath painted ceilings. Below, in locked rooms and sealed chests, lay another church entirely, one built of secrets and silence. Matteo wondered how many had passed through these halls before him carrying similar burdens, and how many had chosen obedience over truth. The oak door to the restricted archive loomed ahead, massive and scarred, its iron bands dark with age. It had been reinforced after fires, after invasions, after moments when history threatened to escape confinement. Matteo reached into his sleeve and drew out the key, its weight unexpected, as if it contained centuries of reluctance. His fingers hesitated at the lock. He whispered a prayer, not the familiar words taught in the cloister, but something raw and uncertain. He asked not for protection, but for honesty, for the strength to accept what could not be undone. As the key turned, a memory surfaced unbidden, one he had heard as a novice, half joking, half hushed. A tale of a pope who had ordered his predecessor's corpse exhumed, dressed in papal robes, propped on a throne, and put on trial. The charges had been absurd, the spectacle grotesque, yet it had served a purpose: to erase decisions, to consolidate power, to send a message that even death offered no refuge from authority. Matteo had laughed nervously at the story then, comforted by the thought that it belonged to a barbaric past. Now, surrounded by proof of similar acts clothed in holy language, the laughter curdled into shame. The door opened with a groan that seemed too loud for the silence. Inside, the archive breathed cold air, heavy with the scent of dust and time. Shelves stretched into darkness, stacked with boxes and volumes bound in cracked leather, each labeled in careful script. Matteo stepped inside and closed the door behind him, sealing himself in with the weight of centuries. His lamp revealed rows of knowledge deliberately hidden, organized not for discovery but for containment. He moved to an empty table and unwrapped the parchments. By the lamp's glow, the ink looked almost fresh, the words disturbingly alive. Here were confessions extracted under threat and recorded as voluntary repentance. Here were decrees granting absolution in exchange for loyalty, indulgence traded like merchandise. One document detailed the quiet removal of an entire family accused of heresy, their lands redistributed to allies who had funded the papal election. The justification cited divine order, the reality was naked greed. Matteo's chest tightened. He thought of the sermons he had copied, the homilies praising humility and mercy, the saints held up as models of sacrifice. He did not doubt their sincerity, but the contrast cut deep. How could the same institution that produced such beauty also harbor such darkness? The answer whispered itself, because it was human. Because power, once claimed as sacred, was rarely surrendered willingly. He did not intend to destroy the documents. That, he knew, would be another form of violence, another lie. Instead, he catalogued them carefully, cross-referencing dates and names, creating a map where once there had only been fragments. If the truth was ever to be faced, it would need coherence. Denial thrived on confusion. Matteo worked slowly, methodically, as though performing a liturgy of honesty. Each parchment placed in order felt like an act of quiet defiance. Hours passed unnoticed. The lamp flickered, and shadows danced across the shelves, as if the past itself shifted uneasily. Matteo imagined future scholars, perhaps braver or freer than he, opening these boxes and seeing the church whole, unvarnished. The thought frightened him, yet it also brought a strange peace. Faith that demanded blindness, he realized, was fragile. Faith that endured knowledge might yet survive. When he finished, he gathered the copies and sealed them in a plain box, marking it with a simple reference code that revealed nothing to the untrained eye. He slid it onto a shelf among hundreds of others. From the outside, nothing had changed. The Vatican would wake to another day of prayers and processions, its image intact. But beneath it all, the truth now lay aligned, waiting. Matteo extinguished the lamp and stood in the darkness, listening to his own breathing. He felt smaller than he ever had, and at the same time, strangely lighter. He opened the archive door and stepped back into the corridor, locking it behind him. As he walked away, the first hint of dawn brushed the high windows, pale and hesitant. He did not know if what he had done would matter in his lifetime. But he knew this: history was not only a chronicle of holiness. It was also a confession, and tonight, someone had finally begun to listen. Centuries before Brother Matteo traced the quiet corridors of the Vatican, another night had unfolded beneath the same Roman sky, thick with smoke, intrigue, and the metallic taste of fear. The city was restless then, not yet softened by pilgrims and postcards, but sharp-edged, alive with rival banners and whispered bargains. Inside the apostolic palace, Pope Alexander sat awake long past midnight, the candlelight carving deep lines into his face. The white of his robes gleamed immaculate, an intentional contrast to the thoughts that churned behind his steady gaze. Power had never frightened him. It exhilarated him. The papal chamber was a place of calculated beauty. Frescoes celebrated saints and martyrs, their eyes lifted heavenward in eternal devotion, while beneath them tables overflowed with maps, letters, and seals. Alexander's fingers moved across the parchment with ease, tracing borders that would soon change hands. He did not see these lands as souls entrusted to his care, but as pieces on a board, necessary to secure loyalty and crush resistance. To rule the church, he believed, one had to master the world it stood within. Rome was not a monastery, it was a battlefield. A servant entered quietly, head bowed, announcing the arrival of a cardinal whose allegiance wavered. Alexander dismissed the servant and waved the cardinal in, studying him as one might inspect a blade, assessing strength, flaws, and usefulness. Pleasantries were exchanged, words chosen with care. The cardinal spoke of conscience and reform, of the dangers of corruption. Alexander listened patiently, nodding at all the right moments, his expression a mask of pastoral concern. When the man finished, Alexander leaned forward and spoke gently of unity, of the church's enemies waiting beyond the walls. He offered reassurance, and with it, an unspoken warning. When the cardinal departed, pale and uncertain, Alexander reached for his seal. He wrote swiftly, decisively, issuing orders that contradicted every word he had just spoken. By dawn, soldiers would be dispatched under the pretense of maintaining order. A charge of treason would be manufactured, supported by testimony purchased with gold or extracted through fear. Alexander did not relish cruelty for its own sake, but he accepted it as a necessary instrument. Mercy, he believed, was a luxury afforded only to those securely in power. As the hours passed, messengers came and went, each bearing fragments of a vast, invisible machinery. One brought news of a rival faction gaining support among the nobility. Another whispered of unrest in a distant province where indulgences had been sold too greedily, provoking resentment rather than obedience. Alexander absorbed it all, adjusting strategies, redistributing favors. He promised bishoprics to one family, absolution to another. His illegitimate son's name surfaced in a letter requesting command of a military campaign, and Alexander smiled faintly. Blood, like faith, demanded investment. Yet even in the midst of control, unease lingered. Alexander knew history had teeth. He knew that someday, perhaps long after his bones turned to dust, others might question his reign. To guard against that future, he issued decrees ordering certain records sealed, others altered. Scribes were instructed to emphasize victories, to frame compromises as miracles of diplomacy. Failures were blamed on subordinates, excesses on necessity. The truth was not erased, it was buried beneath layers of reverent language and selective memory. Elsewhere in the palace, a young clerk copied documents by lamplight, unaware that his neat handwriting would become part of this construction. He believed he served God directly, that accuracy was a form of devotion. Alexander relied on such men, on their innocence and diligence. The system thrived because so many within it never questioned the destination of their labor. Each played a role, knowingly or not, in preserving the image of an unblemished throne. As dawn approached, Alexander finally rose, joints stiff, mind still sharp. He stood before a window overlooking Rome, watching the city stir. Bells rang in distant churches, calling the faithful to prayer. He felt no contradiction between the sacred sounds and the ruthless choices he had made. In his view, the Church's survival justified all means. If holiness required darkness to defend it, then darkness would be employed without hesitation. Centuries later, the echoes of such nights lingered in stone and ink. Brother Matteo, walking away from the archive toward the pale promise of morning, could not name Alexander or his kind with certainty, but he felt their presence all the same. The secrets he had aligned were not isolated sins, they were part of a pattern repeated across generations. Popes who ruled like princes. Popes who feared rivals more than God. Popes who wrapped ambition in scripture and called it divine will. As the sun climbed, gilding domes and statues, the Vatican appeared serene, timeless. Pilgrims gathered, unaware of the confessions sleeping beneath their feet. Matteo blended into the rhythm of the day, his face calm, his steps measured. He knew the institution would endure, as it always had, reshaping itself around whatever truths emerged. What changed, slowly and quietly, was the possibility of reckoning. History's darkest popes did not haunt the Church because they were exceptions, but because they revealed what happened when unquestioned authority met human desire. Their guarded secrets were not merely scandals, they were warnings etched into time. And those centuries separated Alexander's calculated night from Matteo's careful labor. Both were bound by the same reality: power leaves traces, no matter how deeply it is buried. One day, someone would read them, and the past, long confined to shadow, would speak at last.